It is a moonless night in 1924 off the coast of New Jersey. The Atlantic Ocean is pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows light. Bobbing on the waves is a small, unlit speedboat, its engine cut, the crew holding their breath. They aren't soldiers, they aren't sailors in the traditional sense. They are bootleggers, and they are waiting for a delivery.
Usually, this is where the story involves a schooner from the Bahamas or a trawler from Canada, laden with crates of Scotch whiskey or French champagne. That was the standard operating procedure for Prohibition. The ships would sit on Rum Row, just outside U.S. territorial waters, and offload their cargo to the smaller, faster boats that could outrun the Coast Guard.
Exactly. But on this night, the rumors say they aren't looking for a schooner. They are looking for something much more sinister, something that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the water begins to foam. A shape breaks the surface, long, sleek, and metallic. It's not a fishing boat. It's a conning tower. A hatch opens, and the smell of diesel and stale air wafts out, followed by German voices. This sounds like a scene from a spy thriller or an alternate history novel, but throughout the 1920s, this was a very real fear and a very persistent report in American newspapers. The idea was that German U-boats, the terror of the First World War, were now being used to torpedo the 18th Amendment. Welcome to the podcast. Today we are diving deep, pun intended, into one of the strangest mysteries of the Roaring Twenties. We are talking about the U-boat smugglers. Did the German Navy, or rogue elements of it, actually use submarines to run blockade-style booze deliveries into dry America? It's a story that involves hyperinflation, the mob, international maritime law, and a whole lot of missing evidence. I'm Speaker 2. And I'm Speaker 1. And before we dismiss this as pure fantasy, we have to look at the world as it was in 1920. The Great War was over, but the world was still broken. And where there is brokenness and a demand for a banned substance, there is usually someone willing to go to extreme lengths to supply it. To understand why anyone would think a submarine was a good delivery truck for gin, we have to look at the economic reality of Germany in the early 1920s. We all know the photos of people pushing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation was destroying the country. The German poppy mark was practically worthless. In 1923, $1 US was worth 4.2 trillion marks. If you had access to American currency, hard, stable dollars, you were king. Right. And meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had just passed the Volstead Act. Prohibition is in full swing. Alcohol is illegal, which naturally means everyone wants it, and the price has skyrocketed. You have a market in America with an insatiable thirst and cash to burn, and a supplier in Europe, specifically Germany, that is desperate for foreign capital. But let's look at the logistics. Why U-boats? Germany had a massive merchant marine before the war, but the Treaty of Versailles decimated their navy. They weren't supposed to have U-boats anymore. Supposed to is the key phrase. While most of the fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow or handed over to the Allies, the technical know-how remained, and there were thousands of unemployed naval officers and crews who knew how to operate these machines. The theory goes that not every U-boat was accounted for, or that new, smaller submersible craft were being developed in secret. And we have to remember the precedent for commercial submarines had already been set by Germany during the war. This is a crucial piece of context that often gets overlooked. Years before Prohibition, in 1916, Germany sent a U-boat to the U.S., not to attack, but to shop. The Deutschland. This was a merchant submarine. It was unarmed, wider than a military U-boat, and designed purely for cargo. It sailed from Germany to Baltimore, popped up in the harbor, and offloaded hundreds of tons of chemical dyes and mail, then loaded up with nickel, tin, and rubber to take back to Germany. It ran the British blockade without firing a shot.
That mission proved it was possible. You could cross the Atlantic underwater, carrying cargo, and bypass the most powerful navy in the world, the British Royal Navy. So, fast forward to 1922 or 1923. The U.S. Coast Guard is struggling to patrol the coastline. They are overwhelmed by the Rum Row surface ships. If you are a German entrepreneur with a submarine connection, you look at the Deutschland mission and think, why not do that with schnapps? And the Coast Guard was certainly paranoid about it. We have to talk about Rum Row. This was a line of ships anchored just outside the 3-mile territorial limit. It was like a floating city. You had ships from Britain, Canada, the Bahamas, and yes, Germany, sitting there openly. At night, fast boats from the shore, the rum-runners, would zip out, load up, and zip back. It was a cat-and-mouse game, but the Coast Guard could see the surface ships. They could track them. A submarine, theoretically, could bypass Rum Row entirely. It could submerge, travel within the 3-mile limit, enter a secluded bay or river mouth, surface, offload directly to trucks on the shore, and vanish before dawn. It cuts out the middleman of the speedboats. It's the ultimate smuggling vessel. So the motive is there, and the capability is theoretically there. But what about the evidence? This is where it gets really interesting. We aren't just talking about barroom gossip. We are talking about reports filed by government officials. Let's look at the timeline. In the early 1920s, reports started trickling in from fishermen and coastal residents. They claimed to see strange, low-lying craft that could submerge. But the biggest bombshell dropped in 1924, the Hudson River sighting. This is the incident that really fueled the fire. In 1924, witnesses claimed to see 2 submarines cruising up the Hudson River, not out in the ocean, in the river. Photographs were allegedly taken, and let's be clear, the US Navy didn't have submarines operating in that area at that specific time in that manner. The newspapers went wild. The headlines were screaming about a German invasion of booze. There was a specific report from a Prohibition agent who claimed he saw a submarine unload a cargo of liquor on the shores of Long Island. One of the most detailed accounts came from a man named Captain Cluett. He was a master mariner, a credible witness. He reported seeing a large submarine off the New Jersey coast. He described it in detail: gray paint, no flag, the distinct shape of a German U-boat hull. He watched it rendezvous with a smaller boat. And it wasn't just sightings. There were economic indicators. The sheer volume of German liquor entering the US was staggering. We know that legally, Germany was exporting massive amounts of alcohol to places like Canada and Mexico. But the numbers didn't add up. The amount arriving in those countries was far less than what was leaving Germany. The discrepancy suggested a massive diversion directly to the US. There was also the super sub theory. Intelligence reports and rumors circulated that the Krupp family, the German industrial giants, were building massive 2,000-ton carrying submarines specifically for this trade. The New York Times even ran articles discussing the possibility. They quoted officials saying that the impossibility of the Coast Guard coping with undersea rum runners is admitted. Think about that admission. The US government was essentially saying, if they are using subs, we have no way to stop them. We didn't have sonar nets set up for peacetime smuggling prevention. We had destroyers looking for surface silhouettes. Another fascinating incident involves a peculiar discovery in the Caribbean. A diver reportedly found a cache of German alcohol on the seafloor, stacked in a way that suggested it had been offloaded from a vessel that could sit on the bottom, or that it was a dump site for a submarine that needed to gain buoyancy quickly to escape. And let's touch on the organized crime element. We know the mob was international. Meyer Lansky and others had complex logistics networks. There were rumors of meetings in Europe between American gangsters and former German naval officers. It's the perfect marriage of convenience. The mob has the money, the Germans have the boats.
So we have sightings, we have motive, and we have fear. But did it actually happen on a large scale? This is where historians have to pump the brakes a bit and look at the practicality. Right. We have to talk about what a World War I era U-boat actually smells like. It smells like diesel, sweat, rotting food, and battery acid. It is a hot, cramped, miserable tin can. If you put crates of high-end champagne or delicate wine in a diesel-soaked U-boat for a 3-week Atlantic crossing, what does that product taste like when it arrives? It tastes like fuel oil. This was the primary argument against the U-boat theory. Submarines are terrible cargo ships for sensitive goods. The Deutschland carried dyes and rubber, things that don't absorb flavor. Whiskey might survive in sealed glass, but the paper labels would rot, the corks might taint. It's a high-risk transport method for a luxury good. There's also the cost. Operating a submarine is incredibly expensive and technically difficult. You need a highly trained crew, you need specialized fuel, you need parts that, under the Treaty of Versailles, are illegal to manufacture. Why go through all that trouble and expense when you can just buy a cheap surplus freighter, load it up, and park it on Rum Row? The blockade wasn't that effective. Exactly. The Coast Guard caught only a fraction of the surface smugglers. The surface method was good enough. You don't need a stealth submarine when a fishing trawler works 90% of the time. The U-boat theory essentially solves a problem that the smugglers didn't really have. However, that doesn't rule it out entirely. Most historians agree that while there was likely no state-sponsored German Navy rum fleet, there may have been rogue operations.
It is entirely plausible that a few isolated crews, perhaps using modified smaller submersibles or remaining World War I holes, made a few high-value runs. The sightings were too numerous and too specific to be entirely mass hallucination. The Hudson River photos remain controversial. Some say they were tricks of light or misidentified naval barges, but the psychological impact was real. It forced the U.S. Coast Guard to upgrade. It led to more funding for faster cutters and better surveillance. The fear of the U-boat smuggler changed American maritime enforcement. And it fueled the anti-German sentiment that lingered after the war. It was easy to paint the Germans as the villains again. First they sink our ships, now they are poisoning our morals with illegal booze. It was a convenient political narrative. In the end, no U-boat was ever captured full of liquor. No wreck has been definitively identified as a rum sub. But the ocean is vast, and secrets are easily kept in the deep. The legend persists because it fits so perfectly into the chaotic, innovative, and lawless spirit of the Prohibition era. So, were there U-boats in the Hudson? Maybe. But one thing is for sure. If they were there, they brought a whole new meaning to the phrase dive bar. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Let's start with a mental image that seems completely out of place in American history. It is 1924. We are standing on the banks of the Hudson River, just north of New York City. The roaring 20s are in full swing. Jazz is playing in the speakeasies, floppers are dancing, and the alcohol is flowing despite the federal ban. It is a foggy morning, the kind that clings to the water and obscures the Jersey shore. Suddenly, through the mist, two dark, low-slung shapes emerge. They aren't tugboats. They aren't fishing trawlers. They are long, steel cylinders with conning towers slicing through the gray water. Submarines. In the Hudson River. That is a terrifying sight, especially considering the timing. We are only a few years removed from the First World War. For most Americans, the silhouette of a U-boat was the ultimate symbol of fear. It represented the Lusitania, unrestricted warfare, and the terror of the North Atlantic. Seeing one, let alone two, cruising past Manhattan wasn't just a curiosity. It would have been a moment of sheer panic.
Exactly. And yet, this sighting was reported. There were photographs taken that circulated in newspapers, fueling a fire that had been smoldering since the onset of Prohibition. The caption didn't read invasion. It read smugglers. The theory was that these weren't war machines anymore. They were delivery trucks. The wildest conspiracy theory of the era was that German U-boats, stripped of their torpedoes and packed to the gills with schnapps, beer, and whiskey, were running the blockade of the 18th Amendment. It sounds like the plot of an adventure novel. It sounds ridiculous on the surface, but when you actually peel back the layers of history, you realize this wasn't just paranoid fantasy. There were economic, technological, and political reasons why this particular conspiracy theory took hold, and why some historians think there might be a grain of truth to it. To understand the Hudson River sighting, we have to go back to the very beginning of the submarine's commercial potential. Right, we need to talk about the precedent. Most people think of submarines purely as weapons, but in 1916, before the United States even entered World War I, Germany proved that a submarine could be a merchant vessel. They built a boat called the Deutschland. This wasn't a U-boat designed to sink ships. It was a U-boat designed to act like a cargo freighter. It was wider, slower, and had massive cargo holes instead of torpedo tubes. The voyage of the Deutschland is honestly one of the great maritime feats of the 20th century. Germany was being blockaded by the British Royal Navy. Nothing could get in or out on the surface, so they went under. The Deutschland, loaded up with chemical dyes, gemstones, and mail, slipped underneath the British blockade and popped up in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a sensation. The crew were treated like rock stars. They proved you could cross the Atlantic underwater with commercial goods. And that is the crucial piece of evidence for the Prohibition theory. The technology existed. It wasn't science fiction. Everyone knew that a cargo sub was a real thing. So fast forward to 1920, the war is over, Germany is crushed by the Treaty of Versailles, their navy is dismantled, their economy is in ruins. And across the ocean, the United States has just voluntarily shut down its alcohol industry, creating the most lucrative black market in human history. If you are a German shipping magnate looking at a surplus of naval technology and a desperate need for cash, what do? You start doing the math, and the math was compelling. Let's look at the situation in Germany in 1923. We are talking about the Weimar Republic during the hyperinflation crisis. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. The currency was worthless. The only thing that mattered was foreign currency, specifically American dollars or British pounds.
Desperate times call for desperate measures. There were thousands of unemployed naval officers, engineers, and sailors who knew the Atlantic better than anyone. They had the skills, they had the motivation, and arguably they had access to the hulls. But hold on, let's play devil's advocate here. The Treaty of Versailles was incredibly strict. It demanded the surrender or destruction of all German U-boats. The Allies were watching like hawks. How could they possibly hide a fleet of submarines to run rum? That is the million-dollar question. Officially, the U-boats were either surrendered to the British and French, scuttled at Scapa Flow, or broken up for scrap. But officially does a lot of heavy lifting there. There were rumors, persistent rumors, that not every boat made it to the scrapyard. Some reports suggested that unfinished hulls in private shipyards were hidden away. Others suggested that components were smuggled out to neutral countries like Sweden or the Netherlands and reassembled. Remember, the German military was very good at hiding things from the Allied inspection commissions. They were already secretly rearming in the 1920s. So the theory goes that a shadowy consortium, perhaps linking German industrialists with American organized crime, reactivated these ghosts. Let's talk about the American side of this equation. We know that the mob, Al Capone, coastal syndicates, the Purple Gang, they were making money hand over fist. But their biggest problem was the rum row. This was the line of ships anchored just outside U.S. territorial waters, waiting to offload booze onto smaller speedboats. The Coast Guard knew exactly where they were. Right. Rum Row was a sitting duck. It was visible, the Coast Guard destroyers could patrol the line, harass the ships, and intercept the smaller contact boats. It was a cat-and-mouse game played on the surface. A submarine changes the game entirely. A submarine doesn't have to sit on Rum Row. It can bypass the Coast Guard picket line completely. It can submerge 3 miles out, cruise silently into a secluded cove, or even up a river like the Hudson, surface at night, offload directly onto a truck, and disappear before sunrise. It eliminates the middleman. It eliminates the risk of interception. Strategically, it is the perfect smuggling vehicle. And the Coast Guard was terrified of this possibility. I was reading through the archives of the New York Times from 1921 to 1924, and the headlines are startling. You see reports from fishermen off Cape May, New Jersey, claiming they saw gray wolves surfacing at dusk. There is a report from a lighthouse keeper in Montauk who swore he saw a submarine signaling to shore with a flash lamp. These weren't isolated incidents. They were happening all up and down the eastern seaboard. One of the most specific accounts comes from 1923. A fishing trawler off the coast of Massachusetts reported a near collision in the fog. The captain stated that a massive steel hull rose out of the water right next to them. He claimed he saw men on the deck speaking German and that the vessel had no markings, no flag, just a dark gray paint job. When they realized they had been spotted, they dove immediately. Now, fishermen tell tall tales, we know that, but the sheer volume of these reports forced the U.S. Navy to investigate. The U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard actually started taking anti-submarine measures. Think about how absurd that is. It is peacetime. But the Coast Guard started equipping their pursuit boats with heavier deck guns. There were even rumors that they were authorized to use depth charges if they identified a submerged contact in territorial waters. They were hunting ghosts. There was also the Black U-boat legend. This was a specific rumor that circulated in New York City speakeasies. The story went that there was one specific, massive submarine, painted entirely matte black, commanded by a former Imperial Navy ace. They said it could carry 50,000 cases of liquor in a single trip. It became a sort of folk hero legend. People would toast to the Black U-boat when a fresh shipment of good scotch arrived. Whether it was real or not almost didn't matter. It was part of the culture. Let's look at the logistics again, though. Submarines are terrible cargo carriers. They are cramped, they smell like diesel and sweat, they are full of batteries and machinery. How do you fit enough whiskey in there to make it profitable? A surface ship can carry hundreds of thousands of cases. A World War I era U-boat, maybe a few thousand if you stuff every bunk and torpedo tube. That is the main argument against the theory, the profit margin. Running a submarine is expensive. It requires a highly trained crew, specialized fuel, and complex maintenance. If something breaks underwater, you die. Is it worth it for 2,000 cases of whiskey? Critics say no. They say the economics don't make sense when you could just pay off a customs agent and bring it in by truck. However, proponents of the theory point back to the Deutschland. That cargo submarine was designed specifically to be spacious. If the Germans had built a few more of those merchant subs that were never finished during the war and finished them as smugglers, the capacity issue disappears. There is also the question of high-value cargo. Maybe they weren't hauling cheap beer. If you fill a submarine with premium French champagne, uncut heroin, or concentrated industrial alcohol, which was huge for making moonshine, the value per square foot skyrockets. You don't need a massive hull if the cargo is worth a fortune. There were reports of U-boats carrying gold and securities as well, acting as a secure courier service for the underworld.
That aligns with the organized crime connection. We know that figures like Arnold Rothstein, the man who fixed the World Series, were financing massive international deals. These guys were essentially operating multinational corporations. Purchasing or leasing a surplus submarine from a corrupt shipyard in Hamburg or Rotterdam would not be outside their financial capabilities. In fact, in 1928, the British discovered an attempt by a syndicate to buy a retired submarine, supposedly for scrap, but the specifications requested suggested they wanted the engines intact. So we have motive, we have means, and we have opportunity. But do we have the smoking gun? Was a rum-running U-boat ever captured? Was one ever sunk? Not definitively, and that is where the mystery deepens. There are no records of the U.S. Coast Guard boarding and seizing a German U-boat filled with liquor. The logistical chain of a U-boat operation would have been fascinating. Imagine the rendezvous. A U-boat departs from a hidden dock in the Baltic, maybe near Kiel. It navigates the North Sea, slips through the English Channel at night, crosses the Atlantic running on surface diesels to save batteries, and then submerges as it hits the U.S. continental shelf. It sits on the bottom, 100 feet down, waiting for a sonar ping or a coded sound signal from a fishing boat above. They surface, hatches pop open, crates are passed up, cash is passed down, and they vanish. It is the perfect crime. There is also the Canadian connection. We often forget that Canada was the main depot for smuggling. The islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, off Newfoundland, were owned by France and were legal transshipment points. A submarine could easily dock there, refuel, load up, and make the short hop to New England underwater. That makes the journey much shorter and safer than crossing the whole Atlantic. St. Pierre was the Casablanca of the North. It was full of spies, smugglers, and ships. A U-boat in that harbor wouldn't even look that out of place amidst the chaos. That is a very strong point. St. Pierre and Miquelon were awash in alcohol. If you were operating a submarine out of there, you solved the fuel problem and the crew fatigue problem. You were only doing short tactical runs into U.S. waters. This makes the Phantom Fleet theory much more plausible. You don't need a transatlantic monster. You just need a coastal sub that can hide for 12 hours. So if we look at the evidence, we have the capability, the Deutschland. We have the motive, money. We have the opportunity, St. Pierre and the Atlantic coast. We have eyewitnesses, fishermen and the Hudson photos, and we have the missing holes from the German war stocks. Why don't we have a definitive answer? Because smuggling, by definition, leaves no paper trail. If they were successful, we wouldn't know. The only time you hear about a smuggler is when they get caught. If these U-boat captains were as good as the legends say, they never got caught. They made their money, they scuttled the boats when Prohibition ended in 1933, and they took the secret to their graves. Or the files are still classified or lost in the chaos of World War II that followed. There is an interesting postscript to this. When World War II did start and the U-boats returned to the American coast in 1942 for Operation Drumbeat, the German captains seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of the U.S. coastline. They knew the depth of the harbors, the lighthouse patterns, the currents. Some historians have speculated, and this is speculation, that the reason they knew the waters so well was because they had been there before, as smugglers. That sends a chill down my spine. The idea that the U-boat aces of World War II spent their youth running whiskey to New York and getting paid in dollars, only to return 10 years later with torpedoes. It connects the two eras in a way that is hard to ignore. It suggests that the secret war of Prohibition was actually a training ground for the real war that followed. It's a compelling narrative. Even if it turns out that only 1 or 2 trips were ever actually made, the fact that it was possible changes how we look at Prohibition. We tend to think of it as cops and robbers, Tommy guns and forts. But this adds a layer of intrigue and naval warfare. It turns the Atlantic Ocean into a chessboard, and it reminds us of the lengths people will go to for a drink. The demand was so high that it justified using the most advanced military technology on the planet just to deliver a crate of scotch. That is the power of market forces. If the market wants something, the market will find a way to get it, even if it has to go underwater. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one last piece of evidence. In 1930, a mysterious vessel washed up on the shores of Long Island. It wasn't a full U-boat, but it was a semi-submersible. It was a custom-built, low-profile craft designed to run just below the waves with only a small air intake visible. It was dubbed the Rum-Runner's Sub. It wasn't German, it was built in a garage in New Jersey, but it proved that the concept was being actively developed by the criminal underworld.
That's the K-boat or similar designs. They were the drone ships of their day. If the mob was building their own semi-submersibles, it proved they understood the value of stealth. The German U-boat theory is just the logical extension of that. If you can build a small one, why not buy a big one? So looking back at the Hudson River photo, 1924, fog, 2 submarines. Verdict? My heart wants to believe it was the black U-boat, delivering the finest Riesling to the mayor of New York. My head says it was likely a U.S. Navy maneuver that got miscommunicated, but the ambiguity is what makes it history. The fact that we can't say for sure is what keeps the legend alive. And honestly, in the chaotic world of the 1920s, the impossible happened every day. It certainly did. Whether they were phantom fleets or real steel, the U-boat smugglers remain one of the most fascinating what-ifs of the 20th century. It's a story of desperation, engineering, and the eternal thirst of the American public. And perhaps somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic, buried under a century of sand, lies a rusted hole filled with 1920s vintage champagne, waiting to prove us right. Until then, we just have the rumors and the reports. The ocean keeps its secrets well. But thanks for diving into this one with us. It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and treaties. It's about the gray areas, the black markets, and the shadows in the fog. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure deconstructing this conspiracy, from the Deutschland to the Hudson. It's a heck of a story. That it is. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon.